Hi, I'm Kay Williams from Medora Consulting, global experts in Oracle licensing based here in the UK. You've joined today's Oracle Licensing Foundation level webinar, which is about to start. This webinar will last for around 20 minutes with 5 minutes Q&A at the end. So before we start the webinar, if you click on the speech bubble to the right hand side of your screen to the top, that will bring down the chat box. If you can hear me loud and clear, please type hello. And feel free to type in any questions we have as we go along, and these will be answered at the end of the webinar. Please note that only the presenters can view these questions, not other attendees, so you can remain anonymous and questions can be asked in confidence. We will be answering any questions at the end of the webinar, but if we don't have time, we will be publishing them as a Q&A on our website, so please check out the website medora.co.uk for the answers to the Q&As. You'll also be sent a recording of the webinar, so don't worry if you miss anything. So we're ready to begin today's webinar, introducing your presenter, Jane McCulloch, founder and director of Medora Consulting, global experts in Oracle licensing with over 15 years of experience. Jane advises both end users and Oracle partners in the complexities of Oracle licensing. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Kay. Today we're going to look at the basics of Oracle database licensing. In other words, how to calculate the required number of processor licenses. We will also touch on some of the other factors that affect licensing, but I know some of you have already worked through the free introductory module and some of you have signed up for the whole foundation course, which is great. But as we've got a mixed audience today with some beginners, maybe a few more experienced, we're going to work through the data carefully, but keep it interesting by using some examples. We'll start by talking about what needs licensing for Oracle technology and then how you decide for your own estate what you should include. Oracle is a bit different to many vendors. It does insist you license all your servers running Oracle, regardless of whether they're production, development, test, or disaster recovery. There are a few exceptions, and we cover more details of those in the course modules. But for now, for today, we'll assume that you need to license everything. Having said that, Oracle does give something back occasionally, so you don't have to worry about how many database instances they're running on the server. It could be one or it could be hundreds. You're still licensing by the size of the server. So the slide that's shown on your screen now is a basic architecture diagram, and that shows a layout of how you might have your servers installed. I'm sure most organisations are much more complicated, but hopefully it's useful to illustrate the points we're going to be talking about. Lots of applications have an Oracle database underpinning them. They might be in-house created applications, third-party written, some of which can have an Oracle database embedded or provided as part of that application. But then, of course, there's Oracle's own applications such as eBusiness Suite. Users of the application connect to the database either directly or by using some kind of middleware such as Oracle Application Server, WebLogic, or sometimes a third-party software like IBM's WebSphere. And these are shown on the diagram in the middle. The Oracle database is either licensed by the server based on the size of the server or by the number of users who are accessing the database. There are various types of users that need to be counted. For example, users with a login ID that add data directly into the database, or perhaps somebody like a telephone engineer sending regular information to the database through an iPad when they're doing broadband installations, for example, or a temperature measuring device that's connected directly, sending regular updates. So the database is the starting point for everything else, and what's important is the size and type of the server. So complexity is added by virtualization technology, clustering, disaster recovery, and so on. And all of these areas are covered in detail in the different course modules, but we will try and touch on them briefly today. Over the years, there's been lots of different metrics. Some of these have just counted the users, some of them have been server-based, and you might own a mixture of these older metrics along with the current ones. And all of them will have different terms and conditions determining who's authorized to use the database and when. And this does add to the complexity of Oracle licensing, and it might also attract Oracle to carry out an audit. But for the purposes of the webinar, we'll just cover the metrics and licensing that are available at the moment. The database is a family of products, and they all have the same underlying code, but different capabilities and different licensing. There's also a number of additional extra cost options which enhance the functionality of the database for security or efficiency. Some of them are included in the database and some are extra cost. An Enterprise Edition is the full version and allows you to use these extra cost options. Some examples would be advanced security, partitioning. And when you purchase the options, you must match the same metrics as the database and the same quantities. There's also a product called Oracle Enterprise Manager, sometimes known as OEM, which is included with the database and allows the database administrators to look after the database and manage how it runs. An OEM also has a number of option packs to be used for certain specialist tasks, perhaps tuning or diagnostic pack that diagnoses problems. And these are extra cost and must also match the metrics and the quantity for the database. So, for example, if you buy 4 processes of Database Enterprise Edition for a particular server, you must also buy 4 processes of any options, like partitioning or the diagnostic pack that we just mentioned. And most of the middleware products, like Application Server and WebLogic, are also licensed in a similar way. There are a few differences, and we cover those in the training modules, but in general, they are licensed in the same way. Standard Edition 2 is designed for smaller businesses and smaller projects and generally offers a subset of the features of Database Enterprise Edition. And none of the options are available for Standard Edition 2 except for Real Application Clusters or RAC, and that's included at no extra cost for the later versions of Oracle beyond 10G. And Standard Edition 2 really is a lower cost alternative, and it might be useful for some customers or some projects, even though there are limitations in how you can use it. Standard Edition and Standard Edition 1 were the older versions, but they're no longer available now to buy. So lots of customers will still have these, and they can be used up to version 12.1.0.2. And I hope you're writing that down. But you will need to migrate if you're going to use newer versions. But for the purposes of the webinar today, we're just covering Enterprise Edition. It's the most popular and it has the most complex licensing method. We'll cover the different methods of licensing, the different types of Standard Edition in detail in the course. So there's 2 ways of licensing the Oracle database, as we mentioned, either by the size and power of the server or the number of users. So if you choose to license the server, we use the number of processors on that server to calculate the number of licenses needed. So today we're going to go through the processor-based licensing and how to calculate the requirements, although the alternative user-based licensing is still based on the size of the server, so you would need to take that into consideration. But there's lots more detail on named user licensing in the training course. So these are the 2 metrics that are currently available for database and most of the middleware products as well. But if you choose to license by processor, then you can set up an unlimited number of users on that server. And this type of licensing is required if you can't count the users, or the server is open to the internet, or there are high numbers of users. Our processor is generally equivalent of 50 named user plus licenses in terms of the price. So you might want to think of it as a cut-off or maybe a break-even point. So if you've got lots of users that are over and above 50 per processor in your server, then it works out cheaper to license by processor. And some customers will buy processor licenses anyway because it's easier to keep track and count the quantities required, regardless of how many users you have. I guess especially if you can get better discounts when you buy processor licenses. So we first need to understand how many processors there are in the server and how many cores per processor. And this might involve asking your infrastructure team or looking at the original order paperwork for the servers. Alternatively, there are a number of discovery tools that can be deployed within your network to find out these details. So once you've worked out the total number of cores, for example, a server with 2 dual core processors will have 4 cores in total. And you can use that to calculate the number of processor licenses required. So you take that total number of cores, multiply that by the core factor. Now the core factor is provided in a table by Oracle and regularly updated. And as you might not have a copy of that in front of you, we'll look at a few examples. So the core factor for most Intel or AMD type chips is 0.5. So if our example of 2 dual core processors is an AMD chip, then we multiply that total number of cores of 4 by a core factor of 0.5, which gives 2. And that's the number of processor licenses that you need to buy. Suppose our 4-core server actually has Spark T3 processors. Then the core factor for those is 0.25. So multiplying that number of cores of 4 by the new core factor of 0.25 gives just 1 processor license for you to buy. Now, there's some other older servers with perhaps some HP RISC chips, for example. They'd have a core factor of 0.75. So that gives us a requirement for 3 processor licenses for this 4-core server, and there's some core factors of 1, and so a 4-core processor license will need 4 processor licenses in total, IBM Power 7 for example. So all the details are in the Oracle processor core factor table, and that's available on the website to be downloaded. It's regularly updated when new chips are introduced. But as you can see, our 2 dual core server can have a license requirement of anything from 1 to 4, depending on what type of server it is. And that might not be always obvious, and it can be confused by different terminology. People talk about sockets, cores, CPUs, processors, and all sorts. So in a server, there will be a number of sockets available for processors to be plugged into. And each of those processors may consist of a number of cores, so dual core, quad core, and so on, perhaps even up to 32. And that's what Oracle's referring to, processors and cores. So for Enterprise Edition, we need to know the total number of cores added together and then apply a core factor. For Standard Edition 2, it's just the number of sockets that are counted. So just to explain the difference, if we use an electrical extension to demonstrate, this one shown here on the slide has 4 sockets, and each one could have a plug or a processor plugged into it. If we have Enterprise Edition, we need to know how many are plugged into and how many cores there are in each of those plugs to give a total number of cores. If we've only got Standard Edition, you just need to know how many sockets have got a plug or a processor plugged into. So we're counting the ones that have actually been populated with a processor. We will go into Standard Edition 2 licensing in much more detail during the course, but for the purposes of this webinar, it's just enough to know the difference. Let's look at a few examples of servers. We've got some up on some slides here. So, we've got first example here has the server's got 4 processors, and each of those processors has 8 cores. So this gives us a total of 32 cores in the server. So you multiply those 32 by the core factor of 0.5, giving a total of 16. So for Enterprise Edition, you would need to buy 16 licenses, 16 processor licenses for this server. In our second example, this one's got 2 processors, they're Intel Xeon, and each of them's got 6 cores, giving a total of 12 cores for the server. So again, you multiply that 12 by the core factor, and for Intel Xeon it's 0.5. And so 12 multiplied by 0.5, that server needs 6 processor licenses. And then the third example, we'll do this one for Standard Edition 2. This is one populated processor or one socket. And since Standard Edition 2 is licensed by the sockets, it's just this one single one. So you don't need to check the cores, and you just need to buy one single Standard Edition 2 license. Now, interestingly for this one, if you did have to apply a core factor, Intel i3 is 0.5 as well. So this is 2 cores in total and would then also need 1 processor license for Enterprise Edition. There are lots of other areas which affect how many licenses you need to count, and they're all covered in detail in the foundation course and the advanced modules. So we'll just summarise a couple of them here in the time that we've got. So Oracle doesn't recognise the use of third-party virtualization technologies, which it calls soft partitioning, like VMware or Hyper-V, for example, as a way of reducing the amount of licenses you need. So if you have VMware in use, the different versions can have a big impact on your Oracle licensing, especially if you're going to go upgrade to later versions. So in general, the implications of VMware mean for earlier versions, you must license a cluster of servers that are connected together, even if the other servers are not running Oracle. And for later versions, the whole vCenter needs to be included, because servers can use vMotion to move between different servers within the whole vCenter. And it also changes if you're using a SAN, storage array network, or some other kind of shared storage device where servers outside of that cluster or vCenter have access to the same shared storage. Now, other types of virtualization are viewed differently by Oracle, and you might be able to limit the number of processors, and these are known as hard partitioning. So IBM LPARs, for example. Now, there are much more detail for all of this in the advanced courses. So another area which might cause a requirement for additional licenses is disaster recovery. And certain scenarios need to be fully licensed, and others you can ignore them. But Oracle generally recognizes 3 different types. Backup, where a server just acts as a backup server and doesn't need to be licensed. Failover, which uses certain type of clustering technology, and that might lead to a lower requirement. And then standby, where replication or some kind of mirroring is in place, and all the servers need to be fully licensed. Just touching on a few other areas finally. And with most things Oracle licensing, it depends. So you can mix processors and users on the same server, although in most cases you wouldn't need to, because a processor license covers all the users on that server. But as an example, if your server's been hard partitioned, you might want to license your production partition with processors and your development partition by named user plus. You can keep your older licenses. Most of them are bought as perpetual, and as long as you keep paying support, you're still entitled to use them. Although there might be some justification for migrating to the latest metrics, particularly if you've upgraded your servers, because some older metrics are not sufficient for the faster, more modern servers. On support and maintenance, there are lots of rules and regulations around paying support, and Oracle's actually very protective of its revenue. But if you're running an old isolated server with older versions of a particular piece of software, there's no reason to upgrade in the future, and you've got no other usage of that software, then you might wish to discontinue the maintenance, although you might not actually save any money with Oracle. But we do cover more about these kind of areas in the later modules on the course. Okay, so we've got a few questions through on the chat. So let's go through a few of them that have been sent through. William in Canada has asked, what happens if you have an old single core processor? Well, what happens with that one is it's effectively you have to count them all. Oracle does list it as a core factor of 1, and therefore you just count all of the cores. Okay, we've got another one here that is Sarah in the UK. Can you give us some examples of hard partitioning? Well, we mentioned IBM LPARS, but there are others such as Solaris Zones, that's Oracle's own, and OVM, or Oracle Virtual Server. And Will has asked, what about OVM? I heard if we run that, Oracle recognises this for licensing. Is it as straightforward as that? Okay, Will. Well, as with everything Oracle, it does depend, and there are certain ways that you have to set it up in order for it to be recognised as hard partitioning. Okay, we've got another one here. This one's come through from Julie in France. How long does the training take, and how long does the exam take? Well, you can take as long as you like. You'll always have access to the course, and you'll always be able to go back and check through the modules. And the exam, well, we'd like you to think that you would take an hour over the exam, but because you're doing it online, then I suppose you can take as long as you like, really. Let's have a look if there's any more scrolling through. Okay, so we've got a question here. Can we avoid paying for disaster recovery? Yeah, there are certain ways that you can do that, certain methodologies for setting it up. It's a bit more complicated than just that I could probably just answer here. So we'll come back to you on that one with the email answers. But obviously, if you go through the course, you'll be able to see more details on how that works. I think we've probably just got time for one more. Oh, somebody's asking if we can repeat the 2 points on the last slide. So let me just have a look back at that one. Can you have processors and users on the same server? Well, this one, I think, as I said, you probably wouldn't want to unless you've got partitions, different hard partitions set up, because obviously if you've got a processor license, it covers all of the users. But if you've got partitions set up, you might want to set one of your partitions processor license and another one with user licensing. And can you keep your older licenses, and is it worth it? Yes, generally you've bought them as perpetual licenses, and as long as you've been paying the maintenance and kept them supported, then they're all still valid, and Oracle can't force you to migrate. But you might find that it's, in certain circumstances, it is worth migrating to the newer metrics. Hopefully that answers your questions, but you will have access to this webinar. We'll send through a link so that you can listen again if you do want to do that. So I think as we're getting close to the finishing time, we'll just summarise. Don't forget that licensing is based on the size of the server, the number of processors, and the processor type. And you use the core factor and multiply it by that core factor table. If you do have any questions on licensing, then you can contact us here at Medora Consulting. As Kay mentioned before, we are specialists purely on Oracle licensing. We don't do anything else. And in addition to training, we do provide audit support, risk assessments, and software asset management. So we can help you with anything to do with Oracle licensing. There is more available on the website, on our YouTube channel, and we do publish regular blogs, so if you want to check those out. There are some links on the Oracle website you might want to check out. There's a thing called the Software Investment Guide, so if you're having trouble sleeping, that might be worth a read. Obviously the core factor table we mentioned, and some licensing guides. Or alternatively, you can go to our website and we have a resource guide that explains details of where you can find lots of information on Oracle licensing. And then obviously the training courses are available. But if you've got any questions at all, send us an email to training@medora.co.uk. All of the questions that we've been asked, the ones that we've perhaps not had a chance to answer, we will send the answers out in a blog post. So maybe if you've made some notes and you're reading through them and something doesn't make sense, email us a question, training@medora.co.uk. But thanks everybody for your time and attention. It's really nice to see so many people coming on the webinar. That's the end of it, and we hope to see you back again soon. Thank you very much.